Hi everyone, my name is Shannon Brown. I'm a senior member of the research and analysis team at Standards Australia and the host of the Set the Standard podcast. Recently, Standards Australia commenced a piece of work to look at new ways of developing and adopting Australian standards. To complement the model that's already in place and working well in many areas, we're looking to expand our development models to allow new and emerging industries to work within the standards environment, as well as helping us work better in cross-sectoral areas of activity. Standards Australia is seeking your contribution and will be facilitating stakeholder consultation forums to do so. Our leaders and team members will discuss why we are seeking to expand our development models, what we propose to change, and how we plan to implement these changes. Standards Australia has also released a consultation paper which you can find on our website. The consultation paper provides further details about these exciting changes. In addition to this, I recently sat down with Mike Wood, the principal for Telstra's Electromagnetic Energy Strategy, Governance and Risk Management Programme, Kareen Riley-Takos, the General Manager of Operations at Standards Australia, Richard Lambert, our Standards Development Manager, and Summer Lamont, a Strategic Initiatives Officer at Standards Australia, to discuss these exciting changes. I hope you enjoy. A great start to this conversation would be to ask you, Kareen, what are standards?
Well, it's a great question, Shannon, and most Australians wouldn't know. We define standards as, providing guidelines and definitions as to how products are going to be safe or services are going to be reliable, perform safely and consistently, and that's what they are.
Easy, nice and easy. And then, Mike, in terms of in a practical sense, why do standards matter in your industry?
If you think about the mobile industry, you want your phone to work everywhere and you want the telecommunications networks to work. And that's exactly what standards do. They're designed to make sure they're safe. Whenever you hop off a plane and you turn it off flight mode, it connects and it works. And it'll work in rural areas as well as capital cities and deliver what you expect. And it only happens when you've got standards that define how devices and networks and all the elements will talk to each other.
So we know the importance to your industry, we know what they are, but how are they created? Like, what is the standards development process?
Yeah, it's really interesting because a lot of people tend to think that we have, these dark rooms full of engineers. They're just pumping and drafting standards, but it's actually much more of a consultative process as opposed to, having us write the standards. So we bring essentially all impacted stakeholders to come together and they, come up with those specifications, those guidelines. It goes out for a period of consultation. So essentially any member of the public can comment, can provide their input. And at the end of the day, once they've refined, they resolve all of those comments, they have to vote on it. Yep. So it's a consensus process, and then we publish it. So as you would imagine with any consultation, when you're involving lots of different interests, at times we joke that it's a miracle that we even publish anything, but because of this robust process, they're really well regarded.
And Kareen, you've been involved in the standards development process for nearly 15 years. In terms of changes in expectations of industry, what changes have you seen?
I think there's two key points. I think as we're seeing the changes in our environment and how, the pace of change has changed significantly, right? So I think when you think about innovation in 20 years ago, it would take 2-3 years and those lead times were quite okay. But now we're seeing, things moving and changing on a weekly basis. And then when you have a process that just our consultation is 9 weeks, we have a problem here. So we're seeing a lot more this demand for speed to market. And, if we're unable to deliver that, people are going to find solutions elsewhere. I think the second point for us, which is incredibly important as well, and the deep standards people tend to say, well, you can't accelerate the process because it is what provides its integrity. And we seem to think that we can and we should and we have to. But at the same time, it's super important for us to ensure that, whatever we're putting out to market is of high quality. Our stakeholders have told us that. We've done a massive review of our processes and they said, you know what? It's not good enough for you to just operate a process. Yep. We want to have certainty and assurance that the outcome, what you're putting to market, is actually of high quality.
So what's the risk then of not adapting the traditional model to these changes?
Yeah, well, I think, we're already seeing enormous pressure coming from, much smaller industry consortiums that form and they, I have a problem here or I have a need here really quickly. Let's put something out there. Plenty of examples happening. Metaverse is a great one where, there's a strong need for standards. But the current model of, the international organizations and the national standards bodies, we sometimes take a bit of time to move on with it. And those industries need something and they need something now and they're getting together and developing their own solutions. And we're going to be left behind.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like, unfortunately. But then in terms of, Mike, you're nominated Australian expert on 5G and you've provided your expertise on the development of international standards for IEC, for the International Electrotechnical Commission. What role are these standards playing in industry?
The committee that we run, which is Technical Committee 106, if you think about the safety of mobile devices, health bodies like the World Health Organization and national health agencies set the exposure limits, so they set the mandatory health standards. And our committee has to write the testing methods. So if you think about the scope of our group, every person that's got a mobile or a tablet or a network or a base station, which is nearly everybody on the planet, their devices are tested to standards that we've written. So that's a pretty huge responsibility. So for industry, we've got to make sure, well, it's not just industry, it's government stakeholders, there's academia, regulatory bodies, because they all come together. And as Kareen was saying, you get this consensus approach. We've got to write the test methods to ensure that they're robust, they're rigid, so that our industry can roll them out or roll out the networks knowing that they're safe. So I often sit back and go, wow, I didn't realize we had this touch on the whole global society. But then they want, like you were just saying, they want the new technology and they want it quicker. I think we'll touch on that after. But I was going to show you something. Can I show you something now? This, and I meant to show you this at the start. This is Australia's first video phone. Now, this was launched on the 3G network in the early 2000s. Now, I don't know whether you remember these, but making a video call was quite cute and quite cool until you go, oh, what do I do now? People didn't want to hold this. The camera rotates. So instead of pushing a button to choose the front or back, the camera actually moves. I don't know if you can see this, but the point about introducing this, and then this comes with a really sexy belt clip.
It looks really very fashionable.
This was a 2G phone. This is an old BlackBerry, which you used for your email, right? And it didn't work on the 3, it worked on 2G, but it came with this accessory. Now, one of the key things when you travelled, if you were lucky enough to travel in those days, was that whenever you hopped off an aircraft, chances are these wouldn't work, because the device standards weren't in place to make sure that every country had frequencies and devices that would work. So what we have now, going forward, 20 odd years, is the standards have caught up, and wherever you go, your mobile's going to work. So I just thought we can pass this around. I just thought I'd illustrate what these the advances in technology, but these were all tested to the standards we wrote. So we have to keep up with that sort of technology. But this is a pretty old phone. I used all of these.
Looks like a Nintendo or something. It's very...
I didn't put in the 1G phone because the 1G phone weighed about 2 kilograms.
So that would have been...
and it was just going to be too heavy for mine.
Did you steal this from the Telstra Museum?
Well, I'm not showing my age, but I used that phone. That was a brand new phone in its day. But
because that was going to be my next question in terms of you being in the industry for nearly 30 years and looking at this and looking what we have now, like you've seen and been part of the evolution of that industry. Do you think this is the biggest change that you've seen, like in terms of the interoperability of...
I was looking at this and I think, we talked about, the last 30 years. I think for the internet to go mobile, and if you think about, you can make voice calls, and when SMS first started, people thought, well, that's not got a future. Who's going to type in a message and send it to someone? Well, hello, we're only, so many messaging applications later. But I think to take the internet to the mobile world, which we started in 3G and it amplified in 4G, suddenly you've got businesses that weren't businesses before, because everyone, FPOS machines, all the things you can do that you were tied to your desk for, you can now do on the road, and people take it for granted. So that's probably the biggest change I reckon I've seen, apart from COVID, when we took that one step further and everyone suddenly weren't in the office, but they were all at home or somewhere else, but suddenly the demand on the networks, accelerated digital adoption by, at least, 200, 300%.
And you said this, so this mobile was 2000 and...
That was in the early 2000s. That's when we launched 3G.
Yep.
That was the very first very low quality video phone,
Yep.
but it was sort of, a unique sort of novelty. And it soon wore off because the quality wasn't as good.
Yeah.
And so that was the early 2000s. This was in the 90s. People were using these in the 90s. Yeah.
In terms of then looking at the wireless and the mobile telecommunication industry, it's considered then fast-paced, like it's a fast-paced moving industry. I mean, you can look at these phones from 2000 and the way the camera
doesn't seem that long ago.
No, and so it is that fast-paced. But do you think then the current or the traditional standards development model is fit for purpose for this industry?
Well, in fact, no. Look, it's not for these because not for these now. I mean, I'll give you an example. In Australia, we turned on the first 5G networks in 2019.
Yep.
And we're very fortunate here that they've licensed the new millimetre wave frequencies. So we've got this fantastic capacity. We don't use it all yet, but we've got this huge ability to be right up there with the world leaders in 5G. But we didn't have the testing standards. So the challenge to us, we knew this was coming, or the millimetre wave part was coming in 2020. We could either go down the path of a full international standard, which was going to take 3 or 4 years, or we could choose to develop a very quick one. And we chose what I call, a pre-standard or a technical report, which is informative. And we got that done in 12 months. Now, what that enabled was that all the new devices that had come out could be tested to that new process, and governments could adopt that. But the story behind that was that we actually had to choose a method that would be really fast. And a lot of the traditional standards makers didn't want to do it. They said, no, it can't be done. We have to follow the full process of you have a draft, you go out to voting, you have consensus, you do reviews. Meanwhile, we'd be at 6G.
Yep.
So it just wouldn't work. So we actually said to everyone, look, if we develop a technical report that's informative, we get academia, we get the government regulators and the laboratories all together, put our best brains forward, we'll come up with 95% of what's needed. And you know what? It worked. And I was going to illustrate the point. I don't know if I should. Kareen, can I borrow you to illustrate the point?
Absolutely.
Okay, so you think about we're going to be developing new standards for, the next generation of ambulances using this new technology. So with the superfast 5G, they can do pre-diagnosis in the ambulance, get fast scans, and they can do a lot of the pre-work before they get to ED. Now, they can do that if the network's super efficient. Of course, when you don't have the faster connectivity, the file sizes are slow and you don't have that video connectivity. But Kareen, I'm going to give you a lab coat. You're going to be our expert.
Sure.
I don't know that you normally do this in a podcast. So
this is a first.
You're now our super expert medical professional.
Oh, there you go.
Now I'm going to pose 2 questions, and you're representing. Oh, you could be representing the Australian government, right? I'm going to pose 2 questions to you.
Yeah.
We want to develop the next round of 5G devices for medical theatres and ambulances and all the first responders. But it's going to be normative. Whatever we do must be used. What's the chances of you agreeing to all of that?
Well, I think it would be very little risk
Yep.
that I'm not going to get the information that I need, and the doctors are going to be exposed, and it will be a mountain of lawsuits. So no, Mike, this ain't happening.
So that's not happening. So Professor Kareen in your white lab coat, what if we say to you now, we want your expertise. We're going to have a barbecue. We're going to get everybody together, but we just want your expertise into an informative document that could be a pre-standard. It could be a technical report. It's just where we gather that knowledge, and we want you to come and be part of this international group. What would your response be then?
We'll send a bunch of people to come and collaborate, Mike.
Well, that's exactly, my point is that's exactly what happened. And we produced this technical report. People have told us that you shouldn't have done it because it was meant to be for something else. But then I looked at the Australian government's website, and they said this is an unusual step for us, but we're going to mandate this because, and it's on the ACMA or the Communication Authority's website, because it will mean that Australians can get this technology faster. It's all about the words you are asking.
Yep.
And the governments have actually done it, and they've done that in other countries as well. So my thoughts are that to get a fast-tracked process, we almost need to have a pre-standard or some other method where we gather the expertise.
Yep.
We've proved it can be done. We've done it in this group, and it's allowed the new 5G devices to be deployed quicker.
And thank you, Kareen, for
Professor
Kareen.
Yeah.
So do you think that's an example of like the fast and agile?
It's what we've done. There's probably better ways to do it as well.
Yep.
But I think a lot of it's the mindset.
Okay.
Because the more traditional standards people were saying, oh, I'm not sure about that. 12 months later, they said to us, you know what? We didn't think it could be done. But actually, I forgot the trick to it. We got a young professional to lead the group because the YP was a couple of years out of grad, but he had a different mindset. And they came out thinking, I know how to do this. I'll know how to get collaboration. And people wanted to work for that group because they were doing something, new. And deep down, they knew, oh, look, it's informative, so I'm not going to get in trouble if I agree to something.
And then in terms of that rate, so with that new process, was it obviously it was quicker in terms of...
Oh, absolutely. 12 months. We developed it in 12 months. It went out for a quick review and then it was published. And it meant that we could roll out the technology.
So what would the time frame have been if it wasn't?
Oh, we've just published it this year. So what we started in 2018, actually we did a 12-month technical report.
Yep.
And then 2.5 to 3 years later, we published the full international standard because it needs that process. We followed the traditional method.
Yeah. And Shannon, just to comment on that, the averages today for international standards about 36 months to develop.
Yeah.
So when Mike's talking about, I know that for a lot of people, 12 months doesn't sound fast, but you're getting the whole world to agree. So 12 months for an international standard, a technical report where there is international agreement is really way faster than what an international standard would deliver.
What we're currently kind of...
Exactly.
Yeah. So we've been focusing on 5G and the wireless and telecommunications industry. Looking more broadly, Standards Australia recently released a report on the data and digital standards landscape to map standards across 7 key technology areas. Summer, you were involved in the development of this report. Can you talk us through what that report sought to do and what were some of the key findings?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Shannon. So the report mapped international and Australian standards published in the last 5 years, as you mentioned, in key technology areas. So across things like artificial intelligence, data management and interchange, cybersecurity, Internet of Things, cloud computing and smart cities. Along with mapping standards, the report also sought to identify emerging opportunities and areas for Australia in international standard setting. So based on these findings, the report then made recommendations. One of the key findings of the report was that Australia's adoption of data and digital standards was lower than we anticipated, sitting around 9.6%. And some of those key technology areas didn't have any international adoptions at all. As a result, one of the key recommendations of the report was to streamline that adoption process to make it easier for Australian technical committees to adopt those standards here in Australia.
And you mentioned low adoption, that's quite a small percentage across 7 key, like you mentioned, AI, cloud computing, like they're incredibly important technologies for Australia and the Australian community. What's the risk of having such a low adoption rate?
Yeah, it's a good question, Shannon. So low standards adoption presents some broad risks that are common across sectors, and then there's some more specific risks associated with emerging technologies. So broadly, the adoption of international standards endorses their use in the Australian market and Australia's obligations to align with international standards where appropriate. Consensus-based international standards can promote harmonisation across borders, facilitating trade and reducing costs, interoperability and the consistency of product systems and services, and security and innovation. And so a failure to adopt international standards could potentially disadvantage Australian industry and consumers. Looking more specifically at emerging technologies, they present some new challenges if we think about security, privacy, safety. So there's a need for Australian standards to keep pace with rapid technological development to support the safe uptake of these technologies and mitigate some of those risks.
Big risks. And in terms of, Mike, like Summer has touched on the risk of that low adoption, of having that low adoption rate. Kareen has spoken about the current model and the risk of utilising that model for those areas such as you mentioned the metaverse. But if we looked in terms of from an industry perspective, what are the key risks for continuing to utilize the traditional model in these new and emerging areas from a broad sense, not even just focusing on 5G, but in a broader sense?
Will become irrelevant is probably one of the biggest risks, because if we don't keep up with technology, then the technology is going anyway, right? So industries and regulators will find an alternative standards path or an alternative method. And a point that Summer made earlier, we're talking about our work internationally. I think one of the biggest things to increasing our adoption rate is our participation. Because if we're participating, we're getting more buy-in. Because Australians are at the forefront, and we've found that with our standards. But by and far, the largest, the biggest risk, we saw with I mentioned a couple of these early devices, is that we just won't be relevant. And we'll be at 6G and 7G when we're still developing the 4G standards, and you just can't do that.
Yeah.
And I think about the medical sector. You don't want our medical sector and all of the digital divide and all the rural areas to be left behind.
Although we are focusing on the risks of not adapting the traditional model, it still works. Like in terms of and Kareen, I guess, what works well today with the model?
Yeah, look, I think there are many things that work well with the model today. And we often say that, the current standards development process, well established, well embedded, it probably works for a lot of the traditional industries and a lot of the areas that we're involved in. I mean, we have building and construction standards where the regulator in this country changed the cycle of change from every year to every 3 years because the changes so quickly. They were just not, the industry was just not being able to keep up with that. I would say that there are, two elements in my mind that really work well. The first one is Standards Australia, we don't have skin in the game. We're here to facilitate a process. And I think that gives a lot of sense of, the integrity of the process, and people can come through our process and all of those kind of vested interests, different voices will be heard on the same level. I think that's a really big positive, that whenever we think about innovation or changing the process, we really need to think about that piece of the integrity, because we don't want diluted, not useful content going out there and not being particularly helpful. And I think that the second bit is the broad consultation, is ensuring that, we even if it's not everybody can come in and have a voice, that we are targeting those individuals, organizations, sectors, industries that will be impacted by the work that we do. I think that's another big plus from our perspective.
Can I just emphasise the collaboration?
Yep.
And I guess the consensus, because when I first came in, that's one of the biggest things I learned, is that you really are getting global adoption.
Yep.
And there's nothing wrong. I mean, the model works. It's just that you need to have an alternative path to get something a bit quicker for when you have accelerated technologies, because the model's it's actually a very good model, and you get a lot of people participating in it. It's just that you need a couple of pathways in the model, that's all.
And those are the areas where you see opportunities for improvement?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think, if we take a few steps back, and I know we will talk a little bit more about some of the proposed changes that we'll see coming forward. But at Standards Australia, as an example, we tend to have technical committees that are quite broad in representation. We tend to go to industry associations, right? Which is great, because we get, if you have an industry association that represents manufacturers in a particular area, you get that whole view of all the manufacturers, not one or two companies, right? Yep. So it works really well. But again, if we come back to metaverse, quantum computing, tell me one industry association for those technologies. It doesn't exist. And by the time that something is going to be formed or we rethink the model, we missed out. There is a consortia, or there's 2 or 3 organizations that are coming together and they're going to have their own solutions, which, coming back to this point of Standards Australia being an independent facilitator, we don't have skin in the game. Those companies may have. I'm not suggesting that they all do, but they may have. And then it's, when we saw some of those things happening in the past where you had an early mover advantage is when, the world is not connected. We have great examples of that remember, I don't know if a lot of people will remember this, but where if you bought a DVD from the Americas, it wouldn't work in another place. Like those things, we can't afford to have that. Power plugs are enough of, taking travel adapters. We don't want to see that, particularly in those new areas and emerging technologies. They're going to take over our lives and the world.
Yeah, it's funny because you mentioned the companies kind of doing their own thing and coming together. I think for the metaverse, they do have the Metaverse Standards Forum that I think has 1,700 members, and SDO's standard development organizations are involved in that. And by not being in that game, and when the metaverse does deploy across Australia, we're not there to talk about security, safety, if it's going to impact us all, and we're not in there to have that opportunity to set the standard for Australia, we'll definitely be left behind.
And I think that's a great point. I mean, coming back to Mike's view of the world, right? So the model works, but at the same time, we also need to rethink certain elements. And I think a lot of the times it's also being aware and conscious that it may not be that we're going to lead the work, but we should be involved, or we should partner with some of those organizations, because when you think about it, there will be, and the needs for standards, which is a given, will continue to increase. Are we as an organization going to be able to do all of that? Maybe not. And if we're not, then let's partner with others, because we do have a lot to offer, and we have, a network of stakeholders that we can offer into some of these discussions as well.
Yeah. So it's like trying to be involved in some capacity.
Yeah, absolutely.
As we can. Yeah. And you mentioned, and what Mike mentioned as well, the alternative standards development model. So what, that's gone through a process of review. What was the approach in the review process for creating that alternative standards development model?
Yeah, look, from the outset, we wanted to ensure this very pace of the integrity of the process. We follow the rules within the World Trade Organization that whatever we're creating, we're consulting is not going to create a technical barrier to trade. We wanted to ensure whatever new path we were putting forward, we would still be able to say, this is a national standard. This is an Australian standard that has followed that high level process, including consensus. It doesn't mean that, we need to follow the exact rules that we currently have for consensus, but, the common theme of achieving consensus was super important. We also have a memorandum of understanding with the Australian government, which give us the peak status to being the national standards body here in Australia. And we wanted to ensure that we were going to uphold those responsibilities as well. And then, that we were going to be able to meet the demands of the markets. And, I think for a long, long time as an organization, we have had one size needs to fit all in terms of our standards development process. And that's not the reality of the sectors that we engage with. Each sector, each industry has its own challenges, and imposing, a very kind of, rigid standards development process into some of those areas, we're kind of pushing them away. So we really looked at all of those elements to kind of think, how can we deliver these, and being quite creative in the way forward.
And Richard, you're the Standards Development Manager at Standards Australia, and you've been heavily involved in the process that Kareen has just discussed. And within that, there are three new pathways proposed. Can you talk us through those three pathways?
Yeah, definitely. The first pathway we're calling the alternative pathway to the development of an Australian standard. So this is for really those new and emerging areas, and giving the ability to be able to create an Australian standard where the traditional pathway wouldn't work. We don't have nominating organizations. The industry itself is in its infancy. There's maybe only a handful of experts in Australia that have knowledge of that situation. So this is a way for us to be able to create an Australian standard, and that's through Standards Australia being able to lead that work and really use data and research to go, where are these gaps? Where are these areas that we could be providing use, and be able to instigate that work? Currently, we have to have a stakeholder from outside Standards Australia present that work. But this is a way for us to be able to get in there and start working to help the Australian community have standards in these areas. We would do that through establishing the use of a project committee. So not our traditional technical committees, but a project committee that's a broad group of stakeholders that are able to support us in developing that work in a faster way where we can take a lead and start to develop requirements, and really adopting the consensus principles of the international bodies of ISO and IEC. At the moment, we talk a lot around, we have a calculation that's based on numbers and the number of people in the committee voting, but really taking that back in using principles over calculations, and supporting, looking at the support from stakeholders and making sure there's no objections from any industry sort of sectors or stakeholders that are interested, and be able to deliver for those new areas as they emerge. The second one is really looking at the streamlining of our adoption process. So this is touching on what Summer spoke around earlier, and how we can remove some of the admin burden. At the moment, if you want to adopt an international standard, we would ask you to vote on the international standard when it's at ISO or IEC. We then ask you to submit a proposal. We then ask you to support the proposal. And then we ask you to vote on the final document. It's quite a process. And
there's a lot of committed people to be through that.
And as you can see in those fast emerging ones, there's a reason why we probably have 9.6% of them being adopted, because there's a lot of admin work in there. So what we want to do is move to an opt-in process, where if a committee supports this and they want to be part of the automatic adoption, if they vote positive at the international level, we would have a period of objection if there needed to be, but we would move into automatically adopting that international standard on publication. So this allows us to reduce that duplication of work, it reduces the admin burden, and massively reduces that time from where the international standard is published to when we publish our adoption, because it allows us to do a parallel consultation, so we can actually open up for public consultation at the same time that the international standard is being developed, and allow us to deliver that much faster with much less admin burden at the end. We understand this isn't going to work for all committees, particularly in areas for contention, or there's areas where we have to modify adoptions because of Australian conditions being quite different to other places in the world. So it's not for all committees, but for those ones that are heavily participating internationally, being able to adopt the standards quickly in an easy process. And then the third one is really talking about that iterative, fast pace, those new emerging areas within maybe existing sectors. How can we deliver a product in a faster, more bite-size approach? And so we have a product like that already in the interim standards. But what we want to do is really refocus that to create that iterative development and be more agile in our development when it's a new emerging technology. So some of the changes we would see in that is there's no automatic withdrawal of interim standards, which currently happens at the end of the 2 years period. We would move to a review period after 2 years where a committee could look at that product and go, do we want to reconfirm it for longer? We need some more time. Do we need to revise it? We've got new information. We've been able to get more feedback. We've got to update that. Or is it at that point that we can move that actually into a full Australian standard and move through that? So the three big changes are the look at an alternative pathway to an Australian standard for sort of brand new areas that we don't work in at the moment. An opt-in for our international adoptions when we want to adopt an international standard as an Australian, and sort of interim standards 2.0, and a refocus on that.
Some big changes. But in terms of these changes, the proposed changes, what do they introduce in Standards Australia's Standardisation Guides?
Yeah, so our standardization guides, or our SGs, as we call it, are our policy documents that sort of govern the way that we work. So we are updating 5 of our standardization guides. So SG1 on preparing standards is going to see that introduction of the traditional pathway and the alternative pathway, and really showing the fundamental parts of the Australian standard that Kareen touched on earlier and what makes up those parts. And then where do we have a difference of governance pieces to make sure that we, on both sides, on the traditional and the alternative, that we are actually ticking all of those boxes to make sure that we keep the integrity of the product. And it's introducing those changes around Standards Australia in those areas, leading the work, but also when we lead that work, introducing new approval processes. So now it'd actually be approved by our Standards Development Accreditation Committee, which is a higher level of approval than we currently have to make sure that we are delivering with that integrity piece. SG1 is also going to see the introduction of flexibility and user centricity into our standardization guides as principles, and to really be able to meet those changing needs and introduce that as a key principle. We have our SG2, which is structure and organize operation of standardization committees. And that's seeing the introduction of that project committee, which is not a formally constituted committee, but it engages a broad range of stakeholders. And we be able to use that for the alternative path, but also other publications that we currently develop, like handbooks and technical specifications.
Okay. Yep.
SG3, standards other publications, really sees us talk about interim standards and the changes there about removing that automatic withdrawal and moving away from the sort of term lower consensus publications and into other publications, which sort of more accurately encompasses what they are and allows us flexibility that there is multiple different pathways and publications that you can take to meet your needs and what you need to deliver for the Australian community. And then the final two, SG7, which is around the adoption of international standards, and SG15, which is on the Australian involvement in international standardization, is really that introduction of the opt-in process for committees that want to be part of it. The use of the alternative pathway for Australian standards for adoptions, because also in those areas that are new where international standards may be developed, but we haven't adopted them or aren't involved in that space down in Australia yet, giving us that mechanism to be able to adopt them and start us into that foray of that industry. And then also looking at the reduction of our public consultation period for identical adoptions when the international standard has already been published. And we currently do that for 6 weeks, but reducing that to 4 weeks to allow us, again, to move faster, to be able to adopt those international standards quicker. We see it as lower risk. It's an international standard that's already out there and published. So how can we be able to move faster?
That quicker.
And get involved in the international space.
Big year ahead.
Yeah. Can I add a comment on the integrity
part? Sure, of course.
Because you picked, I know I think this is what you're proposing to do. We probably found that in the FAST method we chose to be the number one thing to look at, to make because the experts that are developing these standards, if they know that there's a check process and they can feel comfortable that we've got an external body or academia that's actually checked it, they'll then support it with their national committee. But if you implement a process where the experts that are helping develop it deep down, they don't have the confidence, it's going to put a barrier. So I think the integrity is probably one of the biggest things. And we had to look at, that's why we got academia and others in to help us. But that's probably the number one thing, is making sure the experts are confident in what they're doing. And that was the feedback that came out of our process when we tried it. And we are adopting international standards straight away within 2 to 3 weeks in our group at the moment. And I've seen so many adopted in the last 3 years, I've lost count. So I don't know whether we're following your model, but someone's publishing them really quickly.
That's a goal. That's where we want to get to.
That's what we're doing.
And actually, one of the areas that you mentioned, Richard, was the streamlined approach for the adoption of international standards and opt-in process. And Summer, you're leading work in the strategic initiatives team that supports this new process. Can you talk us through that area of work and its significance, especially for those critical and emerging technologies?
Yeah, sure. I couldn't agree more with Mike. Our national mirror committees are doing great work to develop and adopt standards. And so it's really important that we create governance processes that support them to do that. As Richard mentioned, the opt-in process presents an optional alternate pathway to allow committees that are active in developing international standards the opportunity to opt in to automatically trigger that adoption process. And the pathway maintains the robustness of the adoption process and our WTO obligations while reducing the steps needed to be taken by the technical committee. So the significance of this can really be seen with the sheer quantity of current and required standards in the ICT and emerging technology space. Rapid technological development is increasing the pressure on standards to keep pace, and most of these standards are being set at the international level. So, for example, the ISO-IEC Joint Technical Committee on ICT, or JTC1, has already published 3,375 international standards, with another 484 in development. So this number is expected to grow exponentially as we continue to embrace emerging technologies and transition to a digital economy. And I believe the estimation is sitting around 4,000 across the next decade to support this transition. So this process is really just one small piece of the puzzle to kind of deliver those speed to market standards while allowing Australian experts to focus their energy where it's most needed. And that's on developing the standards.
Brilliant. And in terms then of streamlining interim Australian standards, Kareen, can you give us an example of an industry or sector where this would be applicable? Because is it applicable to all, or is it specific standards, or is it a choice?
Well, I think it could be applicable to all. I think the lenses that we're looking at in this particular point is really the consensus piece, right?
Yep.
So an interim standard in our language is where, there's a need for guidelines to be out there, but consensus may not be there just yet, because it could be something incredibly new. It could be an innovative way of delivering a particular service or a product, and there is a bit of reluctance. I think Mike's example on 5G is a great example of that. Obviously, in the international arena, you don't really have the equivalent of an interim standard, which we do. I think our challenge with interim standards in the past have been that we always called it a lower consensus document, and people kind of frown upon. It's like it's a lesser thing. Why would we want to do that?
Yep.
And they tend to think of Standards Australia and associate with the Australian standard brand, as opposed to, what is it, interim standard? But we're seeing more and more the need for those alternatives, and also making it easier as well to say, you know what, 2 years down the track, are we in agreement now that this looks good, or what have we learned? It's almost like the pilot version, the MVP, before you actually go out with your final standard. So I do think that it can apply. It's applicable for really any industry, particularly traditional industries. They're seeing kind of innovation happening, but people are still not quite sure. There's an element of risk here because we haven't seen this in operation, or it's absolutely new. But we actually want to get something out there. So there is early feedback. There is this point around collaboration, and hopefully down the track, we'll get to a full consensus solution.
Yeah, that's great. And in terms then of the third pathway, Richard, and I know, Kareen, you mentioned it, that I think it's 36 months and then everything is just so fast paced in those critical emerging technologies, and to take so much time to create the right solution, but you're creating it at the wrong time because the industry is past by that stage. How can the alternative standards development model mitigate this risk and create those right solutions at the right time?
Yeah, I think it gives us the mechanism to be able to get involved in that space and be able to make sure that we are starting to develop Australian standards in these new emerging critical technologies. We talk about the 36 months, but that's also at the point where someone then has the feel it's maybe got to the technology or whatever is happening, maybe got to the maturity to then go and we need to develop standards. But as I said, this is the mechanisms. It allows us to actually look at research, look at data, and use that to identify where are these gaps and where are these new areas that are coming, and how can we act on that and make sure that we are able to provide that guidance and that early guidance, so we don't end up with different plugs all over the place, and be able to be part of that innovation and work in that iterations to move towards having, when we get to that maturity point, actually there's already guidance in place and that we're already having those discussions on what that needs to look like.
And your department at Standards Australia is the life of this, is going to bring this to life. How will these changes then be implemented? So
at the moment, the big part is we're going to consultation on these changes. We have a consultation paper that talks about the why. It talks about everything, sort of sums up everything we've been talking about so far today. We're releasing the Standardisation Guides for public comment so that everyone has a chance. I talked a lot. There's a lot of changes I threw in there. And I'm sure people are like, what on earth was he talking about? We get that. So they're open for public comment, so people will be able to review what are those changes in that detail and be able to provide that feedback to us so that we can make sure that we are implementing these in the correct way. We'll have drop-in sessions around Q&As to help understand that, and then use all that feedback that we get to help us develop the procedures on how do we actually make this policy and these new ideas, how we actually make that work. Because again, we've talked around the one size doesn't fit all. So what are all those different scenarios that will come out through that feedback, and make sure that we have that all addressed as we roll it out. And then our strategic initiatives team, engagement team, research team are identifying areas at the moment of where can we start implementing this? Where can we start using this right now? And where are those gaps, so that we can start as soon as we have all of these changes rolled out and working, that we're able to start addressing those gaps.
And hit the ground running then.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you think that these proposed changes to move away from that single and linear model, development model. How do you think these will serve the Australian community?
I think it's massively is understanding that one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah.
As I said, this year alone, we're aiming to 460 standards across how many industries, working with almost 400 committees. One size doesn't fit all.
Yeah.
So this is us recognizing that and giving us that flexibility to be able to adapt to them and make sure that we're actually addressing the specific needs of the Australian community and not the sort of one size overall. And being inclusive and addressing those new and emerging areas so they don't get left behind and we can be at that forefront and supporting the innovation. And then we also talk a lot about there's new areas that are emerging that sort of touch all areas of industry and topics like circular economy and how do we manage some of the risks of development becoming siloed, but actually being able to adapt to deliver for these new ways.
Yep.
And then massively featuring to the access to international standards so that we are really making sure that we're sort of participating at the international level and then making sure that's being supported down here in Australia.
And you mentioned 400 committees. So in terms of those stakeholders, Kareen, what do these changes mean for them?
Well, it doesn't have to mean anything for them. As Richard explained before, in our standardization guides, we're very clear in defining that what we're proposing here is an alternative path to an Australian standard. So the tried and tested and the standards development process that we know today will continue to exist, will continue to support those traditional stakeholders that are involved in the process. What I would like to see is that we learn a lot of lessons in these new alternative paths, and we can bring that into the traditional models as well. And we'll see, even within the traditional model, an acceleration, an ease of engaging with the organization. Because, as we talked about before, we are very process driven, and anytime in any organization that's very process driven, you end up having a bit of bureaucracy, and there is a great opportunity for us. We have already been on a strong journey over the last 3-4 years to kind of untangle some of those, but it still exists. The adoption process is a great example on that, on asking the question multiple times, and we're actively working to kind of reduce those barriers and the time and the admin tasks that we end up imposing on some of our experts. So I would like to see lessons learned and how do we actually bring that into the traditional models, and we're able to have an even more efficient kind of traditional pathway.
And then in terms of that traditional pathway, Richard, how would this new model, or does it affect, how would it affect the work of these stakeholders?
Yeah, so I think Kareen touched on it. For that first pathway is there's not going to be a huge impact, but I think that gives, or I like to think it gives them confidence that we are addressing these new and emerging areas, and that helps us stay relevant. And I'm a big believer of we stay relevant by people knowing about Australian standards and using standards. So actually these new areas being addressed benefits all because it raises the profile of standards and the great work that all our committees do, because people then uptake standards more and start using them more. I think on the opt-in one, it's going to streamline, it's going to make it easier, less effort, ensure we're up to date. And then the interim standards 2.0, I think that really ensures sort of in a more existing areas where there is new technologies that they're able to address that. And they're able to address that much like Mike was talking in that smaller step towards that final sort of full standard that we want. But how do we do that in that speed to market and that agile? And again, reducing time and effort is a massive focus.
So then with that, Kareen, are there any risks to having this new model?
Yeah, look, absolutely, there are risks. I think the main risk that I see is that what we are proposing is obviously that Standards Australia is not going to come up with all the ideas and say, here we go, we have a need here and we have to run. We're still responding to stakeholder needs, but we're going to be driving a lot more of these. And I think at times that can make stakeholders a bit nervous that what's going on? Are they, creating a new standard just for the sake or a market or a capture of something, which is not the case. What we're really trying to do is almost remove the burden from the experts that are going to be involved with the process because people have day jobs and they're busy. And where we can support the development and we're actually putting resources into it, whether it's research, data, people to actually sit with the experts and say, we're going to draft these, just give me all your knowledge and your experience experience and we're going to do the work for you. That's what we want to do. But I do think that a lot of the times, particularly in standards development, people like to hold the pen and it's like, oh no, I control these. So there may be a fear that we're losing control. I think the second point, and we are going to go through this process and reiterate to our nominating organizations in particular that they're still at the core of our process. We're not trying to bypass them in this new alternative model at all. In fact, if there are nominating organizations to sit on project committees, they're more than welcome to. What we're trying to do is address a gap that exists in some areas, in some markets where I'm not going to be able to find an industry association to be able to nominate someone to sit on that committee. And sometimes even if they exist, they don't have the experts and we have to branch out to the expertise completely outside of our existing networks. I think these are probably the two key risks here for us.
That we have. And then Richard, with Standards Australia's management now being able to propose standards development work, what safeguards will be introduced?
Yeah, so I think the big piece I mentioned earlier is that all this work in the alternative pathway be approved by our Standards Development Accreditation Committee that sits as a subset of our board that sits external to us, and they will be the ones that are approving and looking to make sure that we have met those different points, that we've got the data and the research. I think that's the big piece that's coming under a lot of this is we use research and data to drive that work, that we promote and really transparent about all that work that's happening. So people will be able to go and see what work is happening in these new areas. Again, still involving a broad range of stakeholders through our project committees and having those groups of experts contributing and peer reviewing all the work, and then making sure that we include small business and end users and end consumers in all this work that we do, so that we are actually delivering for what they need.
And finally, Kareen, what do you think is you can give me 1, 2 or 3 or whichever comes to mind, but what do you think is the biggest benefit of these changes?
I'm going to come back to the point that Mike made quite early on in our chat, which is the relevance piece. I think that, there is a clear need for standards in these new and emerging areas. The world's changing super rapidly and someone's going to take on the space, right? And what we want to do is that this 100-year-old organization is able to adapt and deliver to those needs of these new markets. So I would say that, it's not only our relevance as an organization, but it's also kind of fulfilling our mandate, which is, to empower those communities to be able to deliver to those markets. And, I think it's all upside, because when you have something new and exciting that's going to be happening in a part of the organization, I think there's also great opportunities for us to learn, get more creative, get the innovation juices flowing, and hopefully we are successful in our consultation and we can get them going, and then we can put a really exciting pipeline of work ahead of us.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for giving your insight. Thank you for listening to our guests discuss these new and exciting changes. If you'd like to learn more and provide feedback, you can join one of Standards Australia's stakeholder consultation forums, where we invite our stakeholders to review these proposals and provide any feedback by the 15th of March.